Since producing our first ABC and Southern Railway locomotives over 50 years ago, the publishing company, which emanated from that first modest publication, has produced and distributed over 100 million copies of books and magazines on transport subjects. And to this we're adding an ever-increasing number of video programs. This is the first in a series of 4 programs outlining the history of Britain's railways, illustrated by a fascinating variety of archive films from the 1930s to the 70s, together with contemporary scenes and working reproductions of the early days.
Whilst it would not be true to state that railways began in the northeast of England, it might be fair to say that the infant technology was refined and grew to be the greatest instrument of the industrial world of the 19th century in the hills around the Northumberland and Durham coalfields. Indeed, the two grew hand in hand, the advent of the railways enabling the coalfields to be opened up and the coal supplying both the fuel and the payloads for the railways. Our story starts in 1726, when 5 prominent colliery owners in the county of Durham came together to form the Grand Alliance and built a wagonway from Tanfield Moor to Dunstan Staithes on the River Tyne. In 1727, a bridge, the Causey Arch, now the world's oldest surviving railway bridge, was built to cross a deep valley. Over the bridge, wooden chaldron wagons were hauled by horses over wooden rails of 6-foot length, set at a 4-foot gauge between the rails. In later years, as the railway expanded, steam locomotion was introduced, but it did not travel over the arch, being diverted to run round. Branches were added, including that to Marley Hill Colliery, which is today a working industrial heritage site, the headquarters of the Tanfield Railway. The railway itself was an instant success. By 1732, it was carrying around 1,000 tons of coal a day in the 2.5-ton capacity chaldron wagons. That's around 400 wagon loads. In common with other wagonways, the Tanfield used inclined planes to cross the rugged countryside, but it was built much nearer to what were to become normal railway standards, with heavy earthworks as well as the famous Causey Arch. The line had its origins in even earlier wagonways, being an expansion of the Ravensworth wagonway, which had opened in approximately 1632, a century after the earliest recorded wagonways in the area on the south bank of the Tyne near Gateshead. Development was slow through the first 2 centuries, but the investment by the Grand Allies made the Tanfield the first of the successful lines. These scenes on the plan of the Tanfield Railway show a locomotive built by the company set up by the famous son of a famous father, to whom we will turn shortly. The line it's working on is part of the original Tanfield wagonway, which survived for over a century in its original form, being relayed with iron rails after 1836 as part of an agreement with the Brandon Junction Railway, when its owners, 2 brothers, were trying to divert traffic onto their own line from the Tanfield. During this period, the wagonways had proliferated throughout the northern coalfield area, with most joining the individual lines to the great navigable rivers Tyne, Wear and Tees, or the seacoast at Sunderland. Further south, on the outskirts of Leeds, another colliery was the inspiration for another early railway. One of the Brandling family from Kenilworth, Charles Brandling, inherited an estate and collieries at Middleton, southwest of Leeds. His familiarity with the Northumberland wagonways led him to introduce this form of transport to his own bits in order to improve access to Leeds. He reached agreement with other landowners, but to ensure these were valid, he obtained an Act of Parliament to establish the Middleton Railway in June 1758, making it the first railway so authorised. At first, horses were used, but in 1809 the track was improved by the addition of cast iron plates to the existing wooden rails. At this time, the Napoleonic Wars had increased the cost of using horses, so Brandling's agent, John Blenkinsop, experimented with steam traction. He produced a successful locomotive that used a cogged track with pinions on the locomotive to increase traction. As the first commercial use of locomotives on rails in the world, the Blenkinsop engines attracted considerable interest. Among those impressed by their working was Christopher Blacknett, the owner of Wilham Colliery on the north side of the Tyne, whose wagonway ran past the house where the Stephenson family lived. Here George Stephenson was born on the 8th of June 1781, perhaps the most important date in railway history. The young George spent his first 8 years here before the family moved away. The Wilham Colliery line introduced steam power in 1813 and went on to use some of the most famous early locomotives, including Puffing Billy and Willum Dilly, both of which are preserved. This is Willum Dilly, now in the Royal Scottish Museum, Edinburgh. George Stephenson's early railway career commenced to the northeast of Newcastle, at Killingworth, where he was appointed engine wright in 1812, introducing his first steam locomotive based on the Blenkinsop design in 1814. It could haul 16 children wagons and ran on a gauge of 4 feet 8 inches. The goings-on at Killingworth attracted the attention of many and led to Stephenson being appointed as engineer to the Hetton Colliery Railway, south of Gateshead, which opened in 1822. He was able to extend his locomotive development here, producing 5 of these locomotives to work over the 7.5-mile line, for which he was also the civil engineer. Stephenson's success at Killingworth and Hetton led to his appointment as engineer and supplier of locomotives for the railway that was to become the true founder of the modern railway, the Stockton and Darlington Railway. This is a reproduction of the first locomotive for that railway, Stephenson's Locomotion No. 1, working on the Bowes Railway, which was later connected to the Tenfield. The Stockton and Darlington opened in 1825, but its roots ran back 15 years earlier, when the Tees Navigation Company, celebrating the completion of a new cartel of Tees, resolved to investigate the possibility of building a railway or canal from Stockton via Darlington to the collieries in the Bishop Auckland area. Through the next decade, the argument for a railway became overwhelming, and on the 19th of April 1819, it received royal assent to an Act of Parliament authorising a railway of 36 3/4 miles in length, consisting of a main line from Stockton to Shildon, with 4 branches to various collieries. The S&D was built to Stephenson's new standard gauge of 4 feet 8 inches, later to be adjusted to 4 feet 8.5 inches, and to become the standard gauge for the railways of the world. It opened triumphantly on Tuesday the 27th of September 1825, when George Stephenson, driving Locomotion, the original of which is preserved at the S&D's Old North Road station in Darlington, left Shildon for Stockton with a train of 35 vehicles. There were 12 coal wagons, a wagon with flour, another with the engineers and surveyors, 1 coach experiment with the directors, and 20 other wagons with passengers. In total, 550 or so people travelled on that train. Everywhere was crowded, and the engine proved itself capable of outrunning every other form of transport. Steam locomotion had well and truly arrived. The Stockton and Darlington was built across the country, having no pretensions as to being part of a trunk railway, and as such remained independent of other lines for a considerable time. It had opened with a mixture of horse and locomotive power, and was the world's first public steam railway with access to all users. This meant that many different operators ran their trains over the railway, which could lead to confusion at times. Independent passenger coaches with horsepower would be reluctant to allow steam-hauled freights to pass them, and since the line was single-track and there was no signalling, this could lead to traffic chaos. Gradually, matters were sorted out, and by 1839, the Stockton and Darlington Railway had 30 steam locomotives, although horses were still in use on some branches as late as 1854, the year the North Eastern Railway was formed. The Stockton and Darlington remained independent for 38 years, amalgamating with the North Eastern in 1863 to form one of the greatest railways in the United Kingdom. By that time, the S&D owned over 200 locomotives, and its territory stretched from Saltburn in the east to Tebay and Penrith in the west. Unlike railways in other parts of the country, where the original trunk lines tended to be the nucleus of a major railway company, the North East, as we have seen, was served by railways that had local status initially, growing organically to increase their size. When the North Eastern Railway was created in 1854, it was as a result of the amalgamation of 4 large companies coming together. These were 1. The York and North Midland. Its main line ran from York to Normanton, giving access to London via the Great Northern. 2. The York, Newcastle and Berwick. This was made up of an earlier amalgamation of railways and controlled railways in and around Newcastle itself, as well as the main line from York through Newcastle to the Scottish border. 3. The Leeds Northern. This was a railway with lines around Leeds and across to Harrogate, Thirsk, Northallerton and Stockton. 4. The Malton and Driffield, a small railway in the southeast part of Yorkshire. Fortunately, the North Eastern was proud of its heritage. We are now in the heart of North Eastern country at Newcastle Central, the great station which served the industrial capital of the North East. As we've seen, this was the focus of the industrial wagonways and the early railways, the first railway to actually serve the city being the Newcastle and Carlisle, the earliest railway to cross the country, joining the east and west coasts. Its first station was south of the River Tyne at Gateshead, opened in 1837, but in 1850 it opened the great Newcastle Central Station as a joint operator with the Newcastle and Berwick Railway, becoming a part of the North Eastern in 1862. These pictures date from 1929, when the North Eastern influence remained strong. Locomotives are seen dating from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the Worsley brothers, Thomas and Wilson, had introduced a family look to their designs, setting a stamp on that most characteristic image of a railway, its locomotive stock. The unique 444 tanks from the railway's last chief mechanical engineer, Vincent Raven, contrast with the small 044 suburban tanks and the clear-story roofed coaching stock. As if to emphasize the rugged nature of the countryside in which they worked, North Eastern engines were blessed with commodious cabs, unlike most others of the pre-grouping railways. However, in the days of independence, the North Eastern was the middle partner of the 3 railways that jointly formed the East Coast Main Line, briefly referred to earlier. As we've seen, the early railways in the North East were primarily local concerns, whose prime object was to transport goods from the point of origin to the point of dispatch by waterway or sea. However, after the success of the Stockton and Darlington and longer distance lines such as the Newcastle and Carlisle, the second quarter of the 19th century saw a veritable explosion in the number of railways being promoted and built. It was not long before plans were presented to Parliament to construct railways to span the country, but 2 were to be of special importance: the West and East Coast Main Lines. The latter was built up piecemeal, but the North Eastern Railway was to coalesce the parts into a cohesive whole. Newcastle was a vital link in the chain, which stretched from the borders through the city to the other great northeastern city, York, headquarters of the railway. York was to become the key on which the East Coast Main Line was built up. Its first railway was not promoted until 1835, and this was designed from the start as part of a trunk route to London, via the railways which would later form the Midland Railway, giving access through Derby and Rugby to Euston Station in London. This first railway was the York and North Midland, and its chairman at the time of its opening in 1839 was the chairman of the York Banking Company and Lord Mayor of York, George Hudson. Hudson realized the commercial opportunities of making money through railways and rapidly set about building an empire. He was known as the Railway King, and he became chairman of a large number of railways, using his position to build an interlocking system during the early 1840s. This included the Newcastle and Berwick Railway and the Newcastle and Darlington Junction, which were to form the East Coast Main Line with the Great North of England Railway, which remained independent of Hudson until 1845, the height of what was to be known as the Railway Mania. During the mania, railways were being promoted throughout the country to every conceivable place, with many competing directly with each other or established lines. Hudson tried to protect his empire by coming to an agreement with the new Great Northern Railway, but his many enemies used this to bring about his downfall. Hudson had built his empire to make money rather than to create a cohesive railway, and with his fall came the end of the mania. The reaction that set in resulted in many companies coming together to form larger groups, with the formation of the Northeastern being one of the most important. Once the Stockton and Darlington and the Newcastle and Carlisle had joined the Northeastern Railway, it had a virtual monopoly in its territory, long before any other major railway accomplished this. Its branches crisscrossing the land continued to provide traffic that completed its journey within the Northeastern system, as well as providing traffic for interchange with other systems via the East Coast Main Line. This was now under its control from Darlington in the south through to Edinburgh by virtue of running cars. This train journey was recorded in the early 1950s. Looking back past the characteristic guard's viewing window or ducket, which enabled him to look along the train without having to put his head out of the window, we can see the typical Northeastern railway stations on a cross-country line, with their enclosed and glazed waiting rooms. This is the Byers Green branch of the Clarence Railway, another railway with a colourful history, and the first rival to the Stockton and Darlington. These junctions connected the branch to the East Coast Main Line, and were built by the Northeastern in 1873. The Northeastern, of course, also had a monopoly of rail travel in the Newcastle metropolitan areas, both north and south of the Tyne. In the late 19th century, it became fashionable for the middle classes and industrial tycoons to live in the coastal resorts of North Tyneside, such as Whitley Bay and Tynemouth, around which a busy suburban system was built up to transport them to the city centre. However, although the Northeastern had a railway monopoly, it suffered competition from tramways, and in 1904 it electrified services around the North Tyne lines, effectively in a loop from Newcastle Central via Tynemouth, Whitley Bay and Monkshaven back to Newcastle. Inaugurated at almost the same time as the Lancashire and Yorkshire Southport line, these two were the first electrification schemes outside London. Other suburban services, both north to Ryde and on the south side to Sunderland and around the coast to Seaham and Hartlepool, remained steam-worked, sharing the lines with the heavy freight movements, especially coal. The main line to the South Tyneside coast was from Gateshead through Bolden to Sunderland. From here, numerous lines connected to other towns and to Durham, including this 1853-built line via Penshaw. But the Northeastern was still primarily a goods railway, and following the successful electrification of the North Tyneside services, it next turned its attentions to the freight side. Most of the Durham coal traffic flowed through Shildon, and in 1913 it decided to electrify the line from Shildon via Stockton to the great marshalling yards at Thornaby on Teesside, using part of the original Stockton and Darlington main line, as well as the Clarence Railway and more recent lines. The Stockton and Darlington's expansion on Teesside has led to what was probably the first town to owe its existence to the railways, but the passenger services to Middlesbrough and Saltburn were not part of the electrification plans. Sadly, after 20 years, the depression of the 1930s led to the abandonment of the electrified services, as the downturn of the coal traffic made it uneconomic to keep the wires electrified for the smaller number of trains then operating. So steam once again took over. The electrification was on the overhead wire principle, energized at 1500 volts DC, compared to the 600 volts DC third rail system used for the passenger services. Remote branches produced small amounts of traffic, such as the border counties line to Berwick, but the core business of railways around the historic heartland was to continue through the 20th century into British Railways days. Much of the infrastructure was unchanged until the 1960s, when increasing competition from road transport brought the first real changes to Northeastern Railway territory. Many of the lines seen here were to be closed in the early 1960s as a result of the Beechey Report, including the line from Shildon to Durham. Shildon itself was to lose its traditional role as a wagon maker in the 1980s, and all its branches except that to Bishop Auckland are now closed. The Northeastern had a few oddities. Gisborne, a Stockton and Darlington terminus in North Yorkshire, was bypassed when the line was extended to Saltburn, and trains had to reverse into the station. Today, trains reverse at Battersby on the only remaining line to Whitby, once the centre of a large system of lines with origins going back to the earliest days of the railways. Whitby saw the advent of the Stockton and Darlington as an opportunity to increase its importance as a port, and in 1826 a line was surveyed to join the S&D at Yarm. However, the costs were high, and in 1832 George Stephenson was called in and recommended a different line altogether, up the Esk Valley to Gromont, and then over the North Yorkshire moors via Goathland to Piccadilly. This opened in 1836 with an inclined plane up the valley side from Gromont and Beck Hole. The Whitby and Pickering Railway survives today as the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, and it is the major preserved railway to feature Northeastern railway practice. The inclined plane at Beck Hole was replaced by a 1 in 49 gradient for 3 3/4 miles, one of the most fierce on a preserved railway. This is the line Northeastern Class P3060 attacking the climb. The Whitby and Pickering was to become a player in the other major industry that thrived in the northeast, iron ore. In the mid-19th century, iron ore was discovered in the Cleveland Hills, and numerous railway plans were laid to extract this. At the southern end, in Rosedale, a mineral line was built to bring the ore to the Whitby and Pickering and to transport it round to Teesside by the railway's connection with George Hudson's York and North Midland, which had built a railway to Scarborough in 1845. The Stockton and Darlington was in trouble at this time due to overcommitting itself to railways at least, but the iron ore came just in time to revive its fortunes. It first built the line to Gisborne, and then built a connection to Skinningrove near Saltburn on the coast, where large ore deposits were found. This line was to become part of the coastal route from Teesside to Whitby, an extension of the original Cleveland Railway from Saltburn, which had been built to serve the ironstone mines. The line was built along the very rugged coast and abounded in sharp curves and viaducts, of which the one at Staithes was the largest. The poor quality of the Cleveland iron ore led to the construction of the Stockton and Darlington's most westerly line, that over the Pennines from Darlington via Barnet Castle to T-Bay and Penrith. This line, the South Durham and Lancashire Union Railway, usually known as the Stainmore route, was built to bring hematite ores to mix with the Cleveland ore to produce high-quality iron. The nearest sources were on the west coast in Cumberland and North Lancashire. The railway is best remembered for its two massive viaducts built of lattice girders on wrought iron trestles, crossing the Deepdale and Beela valleys. The Beela was the larger of the two, standing 196 feet high with 11 60-foot spans and was 740 feet long. A further branch from this line was built from Kirby Stephen to Penrith to connect with the Cockermouth, Penrith and Keswick Railway, which served the West Cumberland hematite mines. This became a two-way traffic, with Durham coke being taken westwards to feed the Cumbrian blast furnaces. We now travel to the southern end of what was to become the London and North Eastern Railway to the Great Northern Railway. Here we see the famous Great Northern No. 1, a locomotive that stands for all that made the Victorian railways great. The engine symbolises the East Coast Main Line of the late Victorian era, when the North Eastern and Great Northern worked in partnership to rival the West Coast Main Line of the London and North Western Railway. Running from London King's Cross to Doncaster, the Great Northern Main Line was a late entrant in the railway stakes. As we've seen, the North Eastern built up its part of the East Coast Main Line in stages, and Hudson's downfall was accelerated when he reached an accommodation with the Great Northern for that railway to enter York. The first suggestion of a direct main line from London to York was in 1827, but nothing came of it. Various further schemes were proposed during the next 10 years, whilst the Board of Trade Commission in 1840 rejected the idea of a direct East Coast route, as the indirect one via Derby was not yet at full capacity. This was the route controlled by George Hudson, but, despite his manipulating, forces based on Lincoln had come together to promote a new line, which, at the height of the mania, produced two schemes: the London and York, and the direct Northern. Hudson's opposition and alternative local lines to serve Lincolnshire ensured both schemes failed to gain approval in 1845, but the following year they joined together to form the Great Northern Railway. This was authorised in June 1846, the largest railway project, 272 miles, and most expensive at £6.5 million yet seen. Hudson realised that the Great Northern had won, and sought to make accommodations to keep control of the traffic to the north. It was when his Midland Railway shareholders and directors discovered this, and the consequent loss of trade for their railway, that they sought his downfall. The Great Northern was planned and built as a trunk railway, and through the second half of the 19th century built up an efficient working relationship with the North Eastern on the East Coast route. A joint committee was formed to build rolling stock, and massive trains were run from King's Cross to such cities as Leeds, York, Newcastle, Edinburgh, and through to Aberdeen. Locomotive development went hand in hand with this, the elegant Stirling singles such as No. 1 giving way to equally famous Pivot Atlantics, seen here. The initial Atlantics, locomotives with a 442 wheel arrangement, had small boilers, but the later ones had wide fireboxes and larger boilers, these engines being seen in the 1930s on the East Coast Main Line. These two boys, the sons of the cameramen, are witnessing the next stage of the East Coast story alongside the main line. Whilst another Atlantic passes us, the train coming towards us is headed by one of the legendary Gresley Pacifics, the last design of Great Northern Express power. These locomotives of the 462 wheel arrangement were the first Pacifics, except for one solitary Great Western machine, in the country, and were perpetuated as the standard frontline passenger power of a London and North Eastern Railway created in 1923 as part of what became known as the grouping. The golden age of railways was the first decade of the 20th century, before the advent of mass road motor transport. However, the Great War changed the world forever, and the railways emerged from it in poor shape. The post-war government made provision for the acceleration of a process already taking place, that of mergers, and created 4 large companies to take over the existing companies. The LNER absorbed the Great Northern, the North Eastern, and their Scottish partner, the North British Railway, this bringing the East Coast Main Line under one ownership for the first time. Heavy freight was still the backbone of the system, so it gradually designed a 2x2 fresh version of his Pacifics. They proved too powerful and had a short life. And the main line had 4 tracks to enable the expresses to pass the slower traffic. Competition remained fierce, and many methods were devised to speed passenger trains. Notable amongst which was the provision of apparatus to restock the water on the move. For this purpose, troughs were laid between the rails into which the crews of the locomotives could lower a scoop. The forward motion of the train forcing the water up into the tender, and as these fields rapidly illustrate all the first 3 coaches of the train. Seasoned travellers knew when not to open windows. Grizzly, or Sir Nigel Grizzly as he later became, was also responsible for the design of the LNER's coaches. This express consisted almost entirely of his characteristic staff. The early 1930s attempts at colour film known as Touffe colour only gave a hint of the rich colours of the LNER with pea green locomotives heading teak-finished coaches. This is possibly the most famous steam engine of all time, Flying Scotsman, working in the 1936 to 1938 period on an express which includes old East Coast Johnstock clear-story coaches as well as Grizzly examples, an articulated dining car set being prominent. The quest for speed continued. In order to make non-stop runs, Grizzly introduced a special form of tender with a corridor connection to enable crews to be changed on route. Flying Scotsman had one of these from 1929 to 1936, as seen here at King's Cross in 1929. Comparative trials between the Grizzly Pacific design and the Great Western's Castle class in 1925 led to an improvement in the Pacifics, the revised engines becoming the A3 class. The engines were named after famous racehorses. These are Black Bonnie, Ormond, Isinglass, and Grand Parade. The latter is seen entering Redwood in 1932. This was where the Great Northern crossed the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway's original main line, a railway later to become the Great Central. 2752 is Spion Cock, seen at Grantham, whilst the Flying Scotsman, the train, not the engine, is seen passing non-stop through York, behind Knights of Thistle. This search for speed was to be intensified in the 1930s, and the ultimate expression of this came in 1935, the Silver Jubilee year of King George V. Sir Nigel Grizzly's triumph was the streamlined Class A4 Pacifics, the first example of which was Silver Jubilee. Here she enters King's Cross with the Silver Jubilee streamlined train, non-stop from Newcastle in 4 hours. The A4 Pacifics were an instant success, and more were built for general service until 35 were completed. However, Grizzly continued GP class, and the last 4 had improved exhaustive engines. The first of these was number 4468 Mallard, destined to achieve immortality on the 3rd of July 1938. On that date, Mallard reached 126 miles an hour on the country's highest racing stretch of line, the East Coast Main Line, between Stoke Summit and Peterborough. Intended to bring the streamliners to a halt more effectively from the very high speeds they achieved regularly. Here she leaves the great city of York, in which she now resides at the National Railway Museum, during her return to steam in the late 80s to celebrate the 50th anniversary of her speed record. Mallard is not the only LNER record holder to survive today. The very first Pacific built for the railway was number 4472, Flying Scotsman. Seen here climbing out of Manchester in the 1980s. This famous engine, which is privately owned, was always a special machine. Released to traffic in February 1923, just after the LNER was formed, the engine was specially prepared for exhibition in 1924 at the British Empire Exhibition at Wembley. Flying Scotsman was chosen once again to achieve another feather in her cap in 1934, when she was used to head a 6-coach special train in connection with proving trials for the streamliners. On this occasion, running from Leeds to London, she hit the first authenticated 100-mile-an-hour ever recorded in Britain, at Essendine, just where Mallard would take the ultimate record. LNER locomotive development was one of the most important parts of the story of railways in the 1930s. The advent of the streamliners was in response to the development of diesel traction on the continent, where the German flying hamburger was setting the pace. Gresley was convinced that steam could equal it or do better. He proved his point with the A4s. But they were only part of the story. For general traffic duties, he produced the B2 Class 262s, a scaled-down A3 Pacific design. This is the only survivor, Green Arrow. It's been said of many different locomotive classes that they were the engines that won the war. And for the LNER, the V2s received that accolade, whilst the streamliners, both the LNER and the German ones, were withdrawn for the duration. The war was a testing time for the railways, with massive additional traffic, reduced staff, and the constant threat of bombing. One of the most memorable images of war on the railway was the picture of one of the Grizzly streamliners, Sir Ralph Wedgwood, destroyed in a bombing raid on York. The ultimate symbol of the steam railway destroyed by war. After the war, the railways were in an even worse state than after the previous war, and the luxuries of the 30s were discarded. The streamliners never returned. Gresley's 3-cylinder locomotives, such as his small K4 moguls, were regarded as too complicated, and simpler, more utilitarian machines were built to replace them. In 1948, the railways were nationalised. But before we turn to that era, we must look at the other major railways that constituted the LNER in England. To many people, the Great Eastern Railway was a suburban system, but this is far from the whole picture. The railway dominated East Anglia in much the same way as the North Eastern did the North East. In some ways it resembled the North Eastern, as Thomas Worsthall had been the chief mechanical engineer of the Great Eastern before moving to the North Eastern. A further similarity was the fact that the Great Eastern was a later creation, the forming of a new company in 1862 to amalgamate a number of disparate railways serving the East Anglian district. The first main line in East Anglia was the London to Cambridge and Norwich line, the Northern and Eastern Railway. It was authorised in 1836, on the same day as the other East Anglian main line to Ipswich and Norwich, the Eastern Counties Railway. Progress on both was very slow, and by 1843 they had only reached Colchester and Bishop Stortford respectively. However, in that year they reached a working relationship which resulted in the Eastern Counties effectively taking over both lines, although it failed to complete its original main line. Once again, George Hudson's name appears, as the Cambridge line became a possible route to the north instead of the Great Northern, and Hudson became chairman of the ECR in 1845. From this date, the railway gained a reputation for bad management, financial irregularity, and sheer dishonesty, which continued after Hudson's fall. By 1860, the ECR was described as the worst in the empire. Norwich had been reached via Cambridge in July 1845, and by the more direct Ipswich route in 1849, the latter built by an independent Eastern Union Railway. However, the ECR bullied it until it capitulated in 1853, taking over its working from the beginning of 1854. In this year, however, Parliament took a hand and insisted that the Eastern Counties should promote a new company to facilitate full amalgamation. This was the Great Eastern Railway, which took over in 1862 and rapidly gained a reputation for being as good as the previous companies were bad. These trains show the Great Eastern in the 1930s, when it was part of the LNER. Great Eastern suburban services had been developed in the 19th century and grew to serve the burgeoning East End of London. In the early 1900s, it went against the trend of electrification, which other railways were following for suburban services, and upgraded its steam services to provide the most intense steam service known in this country. The Great Eastern's country branches served the rural communities for a century or so. The military uniforms at Wickham Market are a reminder that the flat expanses of Norfolk were in the front line during the Second World War, when many airfields were established there, and the small branches proved invaluable. However, the branches, relying primarily on passengers and agricultural traffic, were grown over in the years after nationalisation, and began to be decimated even before the Beeching Report was drawn up in the 1960s. This line, the branch to Framlingham, closed as early as 1952, having lasted only 93 years. It was a branch of the East Suffolk Railway, which connected Ipswich to Yarmouth and survives today, the only line still serving the area. The Great Eastern's Ongar line also survives, but is now part of London Transport. The short section from Epping to Ongar was electrified and incorporated into the underground system in the early 1950s. One of the northern outposts of the Great Eastern was at King's Lynn on the Wash. It was an important centre and was the focus of a number of railways. Effectively a terminus, trains from London featured the famous Claude Hamilton 440 for most of the first half of the 20th century. Like the railways of southern England, the Great Eastern had short main lines, and small engines were quite suitable. The branch to the north of King's Lynn to Hudson included a station at Wolferton, which served the Royal Sandringham Estates. Gresley's Class B 17 460s, built especially for the Great Eastern services, were known as Sandringhams. King's Lynn also saw trains on the Midland and Great Northern Joint Railway, the only intruder into the Great Eastern's territory. Forever an impecunious concern, opened in stages between 1861 and 1882 through King's Lynn, the MGN at one time brought large numbers of holidaymakers to North Norfolk. It provided an east-west link to the Midlands, but closed in 1959, having only become part of the LNER in 1936. The Great Eastern may not have provided heavy freight traffic, but its small, neat engines and many branches provided an invaluable service to the thinly populated East Anglian countryside. By contrast, the final major constituent of the LNER, the Great Central Railway, was primarily a freight railway. It did not acquire its grand title until it opened its main line to London in 1897, and although that line is probably remembered as the Great Central, its original title, the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway, probably sums it up rather better than the later one. The MSL spanned the North Midlands, the southern part of the North West and North East. Its most westerly offshoot was a line from the Wirral to Wrexham. This had been acquired in 1905 from the North Wales and Liverpool Railway, having been opened in 1896, at the time the MLS was at its most expansionist, building the London Main Line. The Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire's roots were in the heart of railway country, Manchester, and the seeds of its eventual destruction were to be seen in its earliest days, for it was composed of alternative routes. The railway started life as the Sheffield-Ashton-under-Lyne and Manchester Railway, opened in 1845 to connect those places as an alternative route to the Manchester and Leeds Railway, which was later to become the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. It was notable particularly for its climb up and through the Pennines, tunnelling through the mountains at the remote spot of Woodhead, where the original tunnel was the longest yet seen at the time. The conditions under which the navvies worked became notorious, the tunnel taking 6 years to complete. The line seen here at the time of its closure in 1959, less than a century after its opening, was typical of the way the eventual Great Central was built up. This was the Oldham, Ashton and Guide Bridge Junction Railway, opened in 1861 as an alternative to the original Lancashire and Yorkshire line to Oldham Mumps. It consisted of 2 portions and used a short stretch of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Stalybridge branch, including its station there, to connect the 2 halves. A more successful part of the Great Central, perhaps, was in South Yorkshire. One of the earliest schemes before the Woodhead Tunnel was ever completed was for a junction railway from Penistone at the eastern end of the tunnel to Barnsley, which was laid before Parliament in 1844. 4 attempts were made to get approval. It eventually came in 1848 under the auspices of the MSL, which had been formed in 1847 by amalgamation with the Sheffield and Lincolnshire Junction Railway and the Great Grimsby and Sheffield Junction Railway. It was said that the initials MSL stood for Money Sunk and Lost, whilst the later GC stood for Gone Completely. Although that fate has not befallen the Barnsley to Penistone line, it has happened to the original main line through Woodhead and to many of the lines around Barnsley and Sheffield, despite the fact that British Railways used the GC system as a prototype for mainline electrification in the early 1950s. The Woodhead line to Sheffield and the lines to Wath, where a massive marshalling yard was the hub of the coal traffic, were electrified on the overhead wire principle with 1500 volts DC current. The electrification had been commenced by the LNER in 1936, but suspended during the war. It was the first mainline electrification in Britain to cover all types of traffic. 2 special types of locomotive were built, classes EM1 and EM2, for general and passenger duties respectively. This is one of the latter receiving steam assistance during engineering works. Investment in the project was huge. The original notorious Woodhead tunnels were replaced by a new bore opened in 1954, which never saw steam, being electrified from the outset. This was one of the flagship schemes of the new British Railways, and the power was switched on 20th of September 1954, with passenger trains taking 56 minutes for the 41-mile journey from Manchester to Sheffield. As an ancillary project, the short branch to Glossop at the Manchester end was electrified, and local services from Piccadilly to Hatfield and Glossop were introduced. They survived the withdrawal of mainline passenger services in 1970 and were later converted to the standard 25 kV AC system in the 1980s. At the eastern end, most of the traffic took the Barnsley line from Penistone to the Wath Yards. But the whole electrified system was closed in the early 1980s, a victim both of the rationalisation of duplicate services and routes as the coal traffic declined, and of its non-standard nature, as BR had standardised a 25 kV AC system elsewhere. BR deemed it uneconomical to convert to the Woodhead route. The third portion of the Great Central was in Lincolnshire, where it enjoyed rather more of a peaceful coexistence with its neighbours than elsewhere. Indeed, from Lincoln northwards to the Humber, it enjoyed a virtual monopoly status, the Great Northern its only rival, and in that case, it was a good working arrangement. When the Great Northern opened the first part of its main line, it ran its trains to New Holland Pier via running paths, the station providing a connection to Hull via a river ferry. New Holland Pier was the terminus for the Great Central's original eastern constituent, the Great Grimsby and Sheffield Junction, opening in 1848. One peculiarity was its bequeathing tramcars to British Railways, a rare instance of a railway operating trams. The Great Central system on Humberside is now the only major part of that railway to survive. The Great Central built the massive docks at Immingham, and steelworks at Scunthorpe were developed to bring heavy industry to South Humberside, so that it is still one of British Rail's most important freight centres. The British Railways era has seen the consolidation of railways throughout the country. In the 1950s, a modernisation plan was introduced, under which it was proposed that diesel or electric traction would ultimately oust steam as the major motive power. During the 1950s, a number of pilot scheme diesel classes were introduced, with a view to their being tested prior to fleet production. However, changing circumstances resulted in an acceleration of the elimination of steam and the rapid introduction of fleets of diesels based on the pilot scheme machines before many of those had even been supplied. The most notable diesel suppliers of the time were English Electric, who had pioneered diesel traction in this country with the LMS and had tested a prototype high-power machine known as Deltic. British Railways ordered a fleet of 22 production Deltics based on this machine, which were used to modernise the East Coast mainline services from the early 1960s, replacing the famous A4s. Diesel traction was seen as a stopgap before mainline electrification. At the same time as the East Coast went over to Deltics, the West Coast was electrified. But from the early 1960s onwards, British Rail was short of funds for investment. Perhaps one of the penalties that a centralised organisation has to face is where to direct investment funds. By the time the Deltics were reaching the end of their economic life in the mid-1970s, there were no government funds available to electrify the East Coast main line. The alternative was the production of multiple-unit fixed-formation high-speed trains, or HSTs, capable of running at 125 miles an hour on conventional tracks. These HSTs were progressively introduced to the East Coast in the mid to late 1970s, and were an instant success, marketed as Intercity 125s. Electrification was the ultimate joy, and in the 1980s it was authorised for the East Coast, starting with Leeds services. For these, new trains, classified Intercity 225, were introduced. This took place at a time when British Rail was being reorganised into business sectors. Mainline passenger services, such as the East Coast Main Line, were placed in the Intercity sector, which adopted a bold red, black and grey livery. British Rail. We return to the Cradle of Railways to see the effect on the freight sector. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, new forms of fuel were being developed, and coal became increasingly uneconomic. However, for many years it was the principal fuel for the generation of electricity, and British Rail was the prime mover from colliery to power station. The traditional handling of coal was refined. Special locomotive classes, such as the 1970s built Class 56, introduced, and merry-go-round working, where the train never stopped moving, speeded up the process as far as possible. However, the true enemy was the shrinking marketplace, and as collieries closed and power stations converted to oil or gas production, railway closures inevitably followed. Today, many of the original railways have gone forever, and in the early 1990s, branches were still closing. British Rail's final form of diesel freight motive power was the Class 60, ordered and introduced before privatisation. This is the end of the line for one of the North East's branches to Redmire. It has now closed, like so many others, but it may reopen. Some parts of the early system survive. This is Eagles Cliff on the route of the original Stockton and Darlington Railway. Once again, single-coach trains work here, now operated by Regional Railways, a British rail sector. Government plans for privatisation will see a return to the S&D's roots, when private operators will be able to work trains over the public lines once again. In some parts of the country, this has already happened to some extent. Stevenson's famous high-level bridge at Newcastle sees trains operated by British rail sectors, some operated on behalf of the local passenger transport executive, which has also taken over some parts of the original railway for the Tyne and Wear Metro. In Yorkshire, the West Yorkshire PTE has promoted the use of urban and rural passenger services and is active in the electrification of suburban services. However, privatisation plans had put a hold on further schemes at the end of 1993. In the south of the country, the Great Eastern, Great Northern and Great Central suburban services became part of the Network South East. The stump of the Great Central's London Main Line, which had worked in association with the Metropolitan Railway, was once threatened with closure, including its terminus at Marylebone. Change of heart in the late 1980s saw a total route modernisation and the introduction of advanced light alloy diesel trains, the Networker Turbos. As a result, the line was amongst one of the first railways to be offered for franchising under the new proposals. The way ahead for the railways was not clear when this programme was completed. Multi-users of the tracks seemed to be the most likely course, and the end of the 1990s would see a very different railway. We end with electrics on the East Coast Main Line. It would eventually see trains from the continent, as the Channel Tunnel was due to open in 1994, and through trains from places as far afield as Paris or Brussels, would eventually run to York, Newcastle, and Edinburgh.